Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this, which I think is the fourth event in our British politics series. And today we're looking at what the lessons are that the political parties can draw from the recent elections. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Tim Bale from Queen Mary University of London, formerly of UK and a Changing Europe, of course, Sara Hobolt from the LSE, our own Paula Surridge of UK and a Changing Europe and the University of Bristol, and last but by no means least, Paul Goodman, editor of ConservativeHome. Welcome to all of you. If I can just kick off, let's talk about individual parties if we can. And Paul, turning to you first, if that's okay. What lessons have the Conservatives drawn, and should they draw from this bunch of elections we've just had?
Just a couple of notes at the start. Obviously, I need to steer clear of Scotland and Wales because I haven't looked at them, and will, concentrate on this extraordinary agglomeration of local government, mayoral, and police commissioner elections. And another cautionary note: I've not yet seen a combined turnout figure for these three, and you've always got to be very careful with these elections because turnout will be lower as you extrapolate ahead to the next general election than the 67% of people who voted in the general election of 2019. So you can never be sure whose voters didn't turn out, whose will turn out next time, and who will turn out who doesn't usually, or will be voting for the first time. So, having said all that, I thought I'd try looking at these elections through the prism of the usual, though not the invariable model, which is your midterm. Government supporters don't turn out because they're protesting, and you get results that show that. So, do these elections fit into that mould? Well, only up to a point. The Tories went down 3 councils in what I call the Greater South East: Tunbridge Wells, Isle of Wight, Cambridgeshire. Oxfordshire was no overall control, but they've lost control there now. So in bits of what you think of as their heartland, they lost councils, but they won more than they lost. They went up 6 in the Greater South East, including 1, Harlow, that they took directly from Labour. So when you look at that and put it alongside what happened in provincial England, the old theory collapses, because the Conservatives, they're up 16 councils and over 200 councillors, including Northumbria, Pendle, Nottinghamshire, Cannock Chase. This is a bit outside their heartland, to put it mildly. And Labour actually lost control of Durham for the first time in 100 years, with the Tories doing quite well up there. So no surprises about what I'm going to say next. I think one is seeing a continuing culture change. Like it was going on before Brexit. There was evidence of it in the 2017 general election up to a point. Brexit has brought it to the fore. The Conservatives, of course, were greatly helped by the vaccine rollout. And broadly, what I think is happening is that the centre-right vote is uniting behind the Tories, with the Brexit party vote folding into the blue column, and the centre-left dividing between Labour, the Lib Dems, and the Greens. Now, another word of caution: I think that's it's true, but a bit simplistic, because the Greens took council seats off the Conservatives all over the place: Surrey, Sussex, Derbyshire, Stroud, Northumberland, and I'm sure we'll talk more about the Greens later. But on the whole, I think this is pretty much as good as it gets for the Conservatives, unless it can go on to win a whole batch of parliamentary seats, in which they were a good second last time, and the Brexit party had a good vote and they could squeeze them. And there's a whole belt of these seats in West and South Yorkshire, running from Pontefract to Normanton and Castlefield, all the way down to Rotherham, where the Tories had no councillors at all before these elections, now got 20, 3 fewer than Labour, and they're quite a sort of powerful opposition. So that's the upside. What are the downsides for the Tories? Well, in party terms, really, not much of a threat from the Lib Dems in these elections in terms of councils taken. The Lib Dems got St Albans. I think the Greens is a very interesting subject. The Tories are vulnerable to the Greens all over the place, where the Greens campaign well, where voters don't want to vote for Labour or feel the Lib Dems are a bit of a tired force. The Greens are a bit of a new kid on the block, and there's always been a bit of a green-blue overlap in some senses. So they've got to watch that. And Labour, well, you know, if I was looking for good news from Labour, I'd be looking at the mayorals, where the Labour took Cambridge and Peterborough and the west of England off the Tories. And in these city areas, among urban voters, public sector voters, younger voters, really the Tories are still nowhere pretty much, and Labour are doing well. Is finally, the big question that keeps coming up in that context is there a kind of red drift? Is there a movement of these younger voters out of the cities into the suburbs and the countryside, threatening the Tories in the long term? Well, I kind of think, as you academics like to say, we need more research. We had a bit of a look at this at ConHome, and we did find the Tories in the home counties down a bit here, a bit there. I'm just going to end for a moment on Surrey. The Conservatives lost 14 councillors in Surrey. I've been talking around a bit, and maybe there's a bit of a Remainy, better off, more old-fashioned Tory sort of flavour there having an effect. But when I've been asking around, really local issues have been the big thing. So in Cambridgeshire and Oxfordshire, it's protests about planning and housing. In Guildford, and you know, therefore in Surrey, you're seeing much the same thing. So don't underestimate the local factors, let alone on the Isle of Wight, which is always sui generis. So if there is a red drift, it does seem to be taking place much, much slower than the movement to the Tories elsewhere in what were traditional Labour heartlands. All in all, I see no reason why Boris Johnson would be put off trying to get an early-ish election in 2023 if the Fixed Term Parliaments Act is gone by then. And that's where I think we're going, unless Scottish independence comes in the way. But that's another story.
Is this going to be a difficult coalition to keep together when we move back to normal politics, and particularly normal economic policy? Is that going to be a problem the Conservatives face? Because it's a very disparate coalition in terms of economic interest, isn't it?
You can't command 100%, 75%, 80% of electoral support indefinitely. Something's going to crack. But the question is when, and that comes back to your word normal. You know, what is normal now? Yeah. And as I say, going back to 2017, there were signs of this happening pre-Brexit when the Tories took that brace of seats in the general election off Labour that were masked by their losses. I mean, seats like Walsall North, Stoke South, Derbyshire North East, Middlesbrough, South and Cleveland up to a point, where they've really built their majorities up. So normal is looking pretty strange. I mean, maybe the new normal, as people like to say about COVID, really is, the Tories for the time being doing better among voters who didn't go to university, who'd be thought of as being working class. And Labour maybe will have problems there for the time being, just as social democratic and socialist parties of a traditional kind are having throughout Western Europe.
Okay, brilliant. Tim, what about Labour then?
Well, it's almost a mirror image, isn't it? Labour clearly performed really, really poorly these elections. I mean, I think it lost something like 236 seats, which, for a midterm election for an opposition is really an appalling thing. If you look back at 2010 to 2014, when they were in opposition under Ed Miliband, you see that Labour won in 2010. It gained 391 council seats. Next year, 857. Year after that, 534. Year after that, 290. Year after that, 324. So you can see that normally Labour in opposition would expect to be picking up seats rather than losing them. And as Paul said, the problem is also where they're not winning or where they're losing, and that is in those seats in the Midlands and the North that they desperately need to win back to have any chance of government in 2023. And I agree with Paul, the election is likely to occur then, I think. I think the point that Paul made about turnout and being very careful not to extrapolate too far from local elections is incredibly important. It's important when an opposition actually is doing well as when an opposition is doing badly. There is a tendency always, I think, for people to say, well, these are real elections. They're not just opinion polls. But personally, I would always take opinion polls over local elections in terms of extrapolating results. I think I'd also say, from Labour's point of view, if I were them and trying to look on the bright side, I'm not sure that to characterise these elections as midterm elections is quite right. In some ways, I think the pandemic has essentially, if you like, arrested the development of the political cycle. So we're not really, if you like, 2 years into a Conservative government in the way that we would normally be. We're almost stuck where we were at the beginning of 2020. And I think I've heard Paula say that in some ways these results are exactly what you'd expect in some ways if that were the case. So I think Labour obviously needs to worry about this. It's not picking up anywhere near as much support as it would need to be able to come back in 2023. But it is, an abnormal time. That said, there are some other worrying signs. They're making absolutely no headway in Scotland. That really is a write-off, I think, as far as Labour is concerned, in terms of parliamentary seats next time around. They've got a new Labour leader there, but I just don't think he can make as much difference as he needs to be able to win anything like a substantial number of seats in Scotland. Wales, obviously Labour have done much better, and there was an incumbency effect here, and that may help them next time around because they lost seats to the Tories at the last election in Wales. So if they can hold on there, that's good. I think the other thing I would say is that Labour really have suffered, I think, in the aftermath of this election as much as they suffered in the elections themselves. I think that the quote unquote botched reshuffle has been an absolute disaster for Keir Starmer. I can't really remember a leader of the opposition's poll ratings, his personal approval ratings, plummeting in quite the same way as we've seen happened to Keir Starmer over the last week or so. And that obviously has to do with the reshuffle and just the general sense that he's not leading an opposition which looks any like the kind of opposition that may win next time around. It's always going to be difficult. I mean, after all, Jeremy Corbyn absolutely cratered the Labour Party in 2019. Its brand is tarnished, not necessarily beyond repair, but quite badly. It lost so many seats that it was the worst result in parliamentary terms since 1935. The idea that an opposition can come back from that, even in a very volatile electorate, I think is for the birds. I think it would be safe to say, predictions are mug's game, but the idea that Labour can win an overall majority next time around, I think, is incredibly unlikely. It needs something like I think it's a 12% swing. It needs a swing bigger than it got in 45 or 97 just to win a one-seat overall majority. I mean, if ever you could say that's just not going to happen, I think you could say it now. What can Labour do? Well, I mean, it clearly needs to up its game. It will help that the pandemic recedes, hopefully, which may mean that opposition, will not continue to seem, as it does at the moment, to voters like carping, like being unreasonable, like being almost unpatriotic. I think that may make a difference. Maybe Keir Starmer actually getting out and addressing a live audience may make people reassess him, but it's very, very difficult as an opposition leader. I think once you've, the electorate have made up their minds about you to get back. which means that Labour do have to think about the leadership. As we all know, Labour's got a very bad habit of clinging on to leaders, even when it's very, very obvious that whether they're nice blokes or not, and they always have been blokes, they're just not up to the job. And while Keir Starmer's obviously got, in some ways, a lot going for him, if the numbers don't look right, then they are going to have to try and make that decision, or he himself is just going to have to try and make that decision. Now, that would be great if there was someone obvious waiting in the wings to take over. But whatever Andy Burnham thinks, I'm not sure that is the case. So, I mean, essentially then, this boils down to Labour is in really, really big trouble.
Well, we'll clip that little quotation anyway, just in case, and play it back ad nauseam. But and we will come back, I think, to this issue of whether Labour's problems are contingent or more structural, because I think that's the big issue. But thanks for now, Tim. And can I just remind people to vote for the questions you'd like me to pose to the panelists, because there are so many of them already that if you don't vote, then I will not. I'll just get confused and leave out questions that you might want me to ask. Sara, if we turn to the smaller party, I'm talking particularly about the Greens and the Lib Dems, which we've touched on. What lessons should they be drawing from the elections? And what lessons should the other parties draw about them?
I guess the first thing to say is that if you are a small party like the Lib Dems or Greens, this is where you want to do well. I mean, this is your chance, really, local elections, because first of all, this is where voters don't have to think so much about who they want to be the prime minister. They worry a bit less about wasted votes. So they can vote more sincerely. They can signal that, oh, they would like more green policies, or they're unhappy with the government. So normally this is a good chance for these sort of smaller challenger parties to do well. And of course, also we have different kind of electoral systems working. So again, that's to their advantage. So that's just the sort of baseline to think about before we get sort of too carried away about how well they haven't done. And I think they were decent elections, especially for the Greens. I think they will have taken some momentum from it. Paul already mentioned the Greens there. The Lib Dems, I mean, this is not a return to their glory days. While they had some victories like in Cambridge and so on, I mean, they used to be a really, really strong party in local elections, and it's not a return to this. And I think they're just facing this very big existential crisis, given that they had their moment in history, which was this realignment around Brexit, where they were the Remain party. And we all know that they didn't manage to capitalize on that. And that must raise a question for the Lib Dems. Well, if they haven't been able to do so in the last 5 years, when will they ever be able to? But for the Greens, it's given them some momentum. They did well, obviously, in places like Bristol, mainly in the towns. They also did well for example, in London, where I am in the mayoral elections. The Greens came third. It's obviously not close to winning, but it still kind of creates some momentum. Now, because of that, there's a lot have been written about this green wave. It's a bit like the German Greens. It's a bit like, and it's really not. Yeah, I mean, so we're not going to see the Greens taking over from the Labour Party, despite what Tim says that they're in trouble. And the main thing to keep in mind here is that Britain, if anything, even with the realignment, even with Brexit, what we've seen is that Britain is a very two-party dominant system, and there's just no real way in for other parties in general elections to make a difference. And I don't think that regardless of who is the Labour Party leader, that we're going to see the Green Party taking over as the big centre-left party the way they've been done in Germany. And that's really systemic in terms of the electoral system we have. So in that sense, there's not really a hope that this momentum, this positive result is going to create a sort of massive change in the short to medium term in British politics. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't cause some trouble. And Paul has mentioned that, Tim has mentioned that in the next general election to the major parties, they clearly can cause some damage. And here you talk about the Greens and Lib Dems, but we used to have another set of challenger parties that have sort of had different labels, UKIP, Brexit Party, and I can hardly remember their name, Reform UK. And they have not done so well. And this, I mean, we saw it in Hartlepool, the fact the Brexit Party vote collapsed, that helped the Tories. So I think the fact that we now have the main challenge on the kind of progressive liberal left, centre left, whereas the main far right challenger party or radical right, or however you want to call them, are no longer there. that means that it's Labour that is primarily in trouble, although of course also in certain constituencies, certainly also the Conservatives. But it does mean that Labour is facing the Conservatives doing very well in the north, but also if they turn all their attention to those kind of seats, they can lose votes to the Liberal Democrats and Green in the south and elsewhere. So there's really this sort of double-edged challenge for Labour in particular. And that comes back to the sort of the electoral arithmetic of this, where I think the only way that both the Lib Dems and the Greens and Labour can probably deal with that electoral system challenge, and the fact that Labour alone, like Tim is saying, it looks very hard for them to get an outright majority alone, is that they have to think about some kind of electoral coalitions, both pre-election and post-election, in terms of making real inroads. I mean, just for the Labour Party to keep on ignoring that and being, oh, we can win a majority on our own after losing Scotland, in terms of, and thinking that it just doesn't seem particularly realistic. So that would seem kind of like the way forward if you were thinking in that terms, to think about, okay, can Labour stand down certain places? Can Lib Dems and Greens step down other places in forthcoming general election to make it, to basically challenge the Conservatives that are such a strong electoral force right now. So I'll end it.
Thank you. And I think the flip side of that is the point that John Curtis made at our event the other day, is that you've got to remember that the Conservatives are uncoalitionable. So, whilst Labour have got a mountain to climb, Labour at least have the prospect of being able to work with other parties. So actually the bar is a bit lower for them in terms of getting into government, but whether or not they will, obviously.
And Tim will know better than I whether or not that's the kind of conversation they're having. But of course, that is how social democratic parties across Europe ultimately get into government. They don't win an outright majority by themselves, even in PR systems. I mean, that's just not the electoral game that centre-left parties are in. And of course, also not the centre-right. This is all about a kind of progressive coalition across this new left, old left spectrum. And again, as you say, here it's more obvious for the Lib Dems and for Greens to have some kind of conversation with Labour than it would be. And especially the Lib Dems being so burned after going into a coalition with the Conservatives.
Can I just say, I mean, I would say, apart from the practical difficulties of getting that electoral pact together, which actually Mark Wallace from ConservativeHome wrote a really good piece about in the I newspaper recently. It's also a kind of rhetorical problem for the Labour Party, because if they admit that, then the electorate feels that the Labour can't win. And if they don't admit that, as Sara says, they're being unrealistic. They get into the kind of the Joe Swinson problem of Keir Starmer or whoever might take over from him if he goes, sort of saying, I can be the Prime Minister, and it being absolutely obvious from the opinion polls that he or she can't be the Prime Minister. So it's really, really difficult, I think.
And of course, we all remember 2015 and the problems involved in talk of working with the SNP. The whole sort of coalition of chaos thing. Paula, there's been a lot of talk about how COVID has changed politics and made people amenable to sort of more radical solutions than perhaps they were willing to countenance beforehand. That this, Build Back Better and all these slogans are about, we have to do things very differently going forward. Is there evidence that that's what the public are after as we come out of the pandemic?
Not really. So there's, as you say, there's been an awful lot of talk about it and really not much evidence to suggest that that's actually where the public are at. Tim already mentioned that this idea that I think politics has kind of been paused in almost like, almost look like put in the freezer for a little while post pandemic and hasn't returned to anything like normal yet. And I think we need to perhaps talk about what normal means in these circumstances, because I don't think we've had anything that looks like normal politics in the UK for really quite a long time, even before the pandemic. So I'm not sure any of us really know what normal would look like. But there's no evidence that there's this sense of wanting really radical change. If there was, we wouldn't expect to see incumbents doing particularly well in elections, and the polling around, what do people want to do? Do they want to get back to normal? Do they want a radical change? Questions about inequality that we saw from some of the Policy Institute work a couple of months ago. There just isn't the evidence there that people are clamouring for that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that a party that wanted to do that couldn't generate that clamour if they wanted to, if they were offering a bold solution, if they were offering something that was about building back better. At the moment, all the momentum on that is with the Conservatives and the levelling up agenda. So any kind of idea of change is coming through that agenda rather than a kind of agenda of building back better that many people thought was, and we saw a lot of talk about it about this time last year, you know, we can't go back, we must value key workers, all these kinds of things that have just kind of disappeared from the debate since. And the one thing I'd say that kind of underpins all the things everybody else has said is that we know from everything that happened in 2019, which feels like a lifetime ago now, given everything we've been through over the last year. But if we look at everything that happened in 2019, if we look at the polling from the start of the year to the general election, we know that the electorate are volatile. And I don't think that volatility has gone away. The fact that people are voting for different parties and in different patterns means they're less connected to parties. And so they are more volatile. And I think that means that although things look really problematic for Labour at the moment and quite solid for the Conservatives at the moment, I think there is still that possibility that things could change really quickly with the right kind of catalyst underneath them. We saw that very rapid change happen twice during the course of 2019, first at the European Parliament elections and then very rapidly once we got into autumn 2019. I don't think there's any reason that can't happen again. I'm not saying necessarily will, because it does require that catalyst to be there, whether that's a new policy vision for Labour, a new leader for Labour, a new challenge, as Sara's alluded to, on the right of the Conservatives, even kind of winning back that Brexit party UKIP vote and changing the dynamic. But I don't think we can rule that out completely. Once kind of politics is defrosted again, if you like, so once we come out of this kind of pause, we don't quite know what's going to come next, I don't think. You're on mute, Anand.
Good, you'd think I'd have learned by now. And I suppose the flip side is that, you know, we don't know how well the government will perform going forward, sort of as we come out of the pandemic. That, you know, the vaccine effect is there now, clearly, but if the government is seen not to be doing very, very well and the system is as volatile as you say, then things can change quite quickly. Now, I should just stress to the audience, you are allowed to ask questions about parties other than the Labour Party. But let's get started with your questions about the Labour Party now. And I suppose the first question from Peter Williamson is the one I hinted at before, which is sort of, to what extent are the problems of the Labour Party down to bad tactics, bad messaging, or to what extent are they far more profound and more serious and structural, or are they a horrible combination of both? It's a small question for someone to get their teeth.
I mean, I would say they are a horrible combination of both. I mean, you know, the realignment of British politics, which occurred after Brexit, but in some ways was, you know, going on before Brexit, and Brexit you know, was the catalyst and accelerated that movement, has really disadvantaged them in the sense that, you know, because of this sorting of the vote, particularly by place, Labour is, you know, piling up big majorities in more urban areas with, you know, better educated and younger populations, while the Conservative vote is just much better distributed, and they do better in smaller towns and other areas. That is a real problem for Labour. And although, you know, there will be some, if you like, unwinding of that, it won't be quick enough to help Labour at the next election, and maybe even the election after that. So actually Labour, to some extent, has to admit that it's, you know, it's wading through, let's say, mud in order to be able to win an election or you know, stand any chance even of being the largest party. Now that, as Paula said, doesn't mean that an opposition party, you know, can't to some extent make the weather. It has some control over, you know, the framing of debates, what people are thinking about, the salience of particular issues. But compared to a government, you know, its power to dictate the agenda is you know, relatively small. What it has got is you know, the potential to make a difference with a leader who is attractive to voters, and we know, increasingly over time, leaders seem to be more of a heuristic for voters. So getting the leadership right is really, really crucial. I mean, on policy, I think John Curtis was making the point in your event on Monday or Tuesday that fortune favours the brave, as it were, the bold. And look at Boris Johnson. He took a risk, actually, a gamble in going so strongly for Brexit in the way that he did, and it paid off. But I think it's actually quite difficult to do that in opposition, and it's quite difficult to do that simply with policy as well, because they'll come up, against the old problem for oppositions, which is if you come up with anything that's halfway good or attractive, then the government will nick it anyway. I think that is a real problem.
I mean, Sara, you intimated before that we're not turning into Germany and that the Greens can't look over at what's happening there and think, oh, that will be us next. But do Labour face the same structural problems that many social democratic parties in continental Europe have faced, that squeeze that can be absolutely crippling to them?
Yeah, I think there's a clear parallel to what we're seeing across continental Europe in terms of the demand side. When you look at the old electoral coalitions of the center-left social democratic parties, where you had the manual working class voters, you had the public sector voters and the urban professionals, which was certainly in terms of manual working class voters, were based in quite strong class identities and very strong, long-standing attachments to the Labour Party or similar social democratic parties. Now that's crumbling. Paula already suggested this increasing electoral volatility that we're seeing, both here in the UK, but also on the continent, means that people, just because they're in a particular profession and they're manual working class, don't necessarily think they have to vote Labour. And we can see now they do actually, a majority of them vote Conservative. Now, of course, that can also turn around, as Paula suggested, and at some point, this volatility can go in the favour of both sides, both parties. But right now, that sort of old electoral coalition is certainly something that Labour cannot count on. And that's what we've seen. We've seen a very much more drastic decline of socialist, social democratic parties in Europe, in France, where they are almost non-existent as a sort of major electoral force and been taken over, replaced by Macron's En Marche. In Greece, where PASOK has also been replaced by Syriza. And so, some of these social democrats, and of course Germany, where the Green Party are now the major center-left party. So in some of these countries, the social democratic parties face even greater challenges, you could argue, than Labour. Now, so on the demand side, we clearly see some similarities. I think there's a big fundamental difference. And that's, of course, the first past the post electoral system. And that offers protections for Labour. In a sense, you can't just have En Marche or the Green Party swooping in and saying, OK, now we're taking over in the way that we've seen it on the continent. So in a way, this two-party system protects, even when you have an unpopular leader. In some ways, Corbyn, I think, polls are even more unpopular than Keir Starmer is even now. And still, the Labour Party did quite well. Now, so that protects Labour, but it also means that the possibility that the social democratic parties have in Europe, which is these progressives saying, OK, we only have 20% of the vote, but we'd go together with the centrist liberals, with the new left parties, the Greens, and form an electoral coalition and alliance. That's not something that is as easy for the Labour Party to do in this system. They sort of have to go it alone. So they have to be able to have an electoral appeal in the way that Boris Johnson has managed to, that is really this broad coalition that's catch-all enough to keep on to these urban, metropolitan younger voters and also appeal to enough of the kind of more traditional base. And I guess they're not quite managing that at the moment, but that's the challenge they face. I do think in terms of talking about the Labour Party, there's a lot of focus looking sort of backwards at the traditional heartlands, and not a lot of focus that if that's fully the way they go, they do face that challenge that actually some of the electoral, where they have an electoral advantage, younger voters, urban voters, more well-educated voters, is a potentially growing part, certainly of the population, although hopefully for Labour also of the electorate. Of course, these are not the same things. And so if they entirely turn their backs on that, that's also not necessarily a winning strategy for Labour. And that's what we've seen also on the continent. So there's certainly structural challenges, but some of it, of course, also come down to strategy. But if we just look at the polls, Labour still does better than most social democratic parties across the continent. So it's not all over yet.
But also the other strange thing would be, you know, a party that exists explicitly to provide representation for a certain sort of voter isn't getting voted for by that voter anymore. I mean, it's you know, redefining yourself is quite hard if you're the Labour Party. But another paradox here for me is, you know, we've mentioned Brexit in passing, and Brexit is accelerating shifts that have been underway in our electorate for some time, and yet the main opposition party seems determined to act as if Brexit doesn't exist, never to mention it, never to touch on it, to sort of go about business without talking about it. Is that sustainable? Is that the right strategy for Labour, do we think? Or are they going to have to sort of address the B issue at some point?
Well, it hasn't worked. So, I mean, it clearly hasn't worked. It's been a strategy, and I think Paula can talk more about this, but the two things. First of all, we see that in these elections, they did better. Conservatives won more votes in sort of leave-leaning, strong leave areas. But the other thing that I think Paula can elaborate on is this underlying sort of cultural dimension so it's not just Brexit in itself, it's also some of the values that are associated with Brexit, where Boris Johnson is clearly seen as more of a champion of those values like national sovereignty, this sort of identity politics. So even if Brexit becomes less salient, as it has done, some of that underlying realignment that we've seen that tempted many voters that might have traditionally been Labour voters to vote Conservative, that will continue to exist and cause trouble for the Labour Party.
Paula, do you want to come on this?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to come in on the earlier point slightly as well, because I think some of what we saw, I mean, the reaction to the local election results on the Hartlepool loss over that weekend in the Labour Party was really quite extraordinary. And Paul mentioned at the start about turnout. We haven't got aggregate turnout figures, but we're looking at turnouts at ward level that range somewhere between 24% and 50%. So to react in that way to when actually the opinion polls the week before were suggesting that things were narrowing, then you react in such a dramatic way. And I think one of the things that was behind that was precisely because there were parts of the Labour Party that thought their problems were short term and that had expected this kind of almost immediate bounce back. Once they'd stopped talking about Brexit, once they'd changed leader, they could kind of bounce back quite quickly. And the thing that these elections showed them was that actually they couldn't, and that there were these long-term structural trends. And it wasn't just a case of not talking about Brexit and appearing competent, that there's something more structural to deal with. And I think that's the thing that's got to be picked up now for Labour, but it's also there for the Conservatives as well, because it does pose challenges. Our electoral system, it forces parties to make broad coalitions. And in a system where we're seeing values fragment into smaller groups, holding those coalitions together becomes more and more difficult. And I think that actually poses challenges for both parties.
Can I just add to that, though, on the other side of things with regard to the Hartlepool result, and it also obviously applies, I think, to Batley and Spen, where the next by-election is going to occur. There are a whole bunch of people in the Labour Party who, quite frankly, were pleased to have lost the Hartlepool by-election and would be pleased if they lost the Batley and Spen election, because it, gives them the chance to say that the direction in which, Keir Starmer has tried to take the party is wrong. That they made a mistake by electing him in the first place, that they need to stick to the kind of radical agenda that Jeremy Corbyn offered in 2017, supposedly so successfully, and in 2019, where they still managed to win the moral argument. So Labour has got a real problem there. There are a bunch of people. I'm not saying that Labour's problems are all down to this bunch of people, but there are a whole bunch of people in the Labour Party who, quite frankly, at the moment anyway, are quite happy to see it do badly, because it allows them to refight, as it were, the leadership election of 2020.
When it comes to lead, I mean, Paul, is there a leader in waiting in the Labour Party that the Conservatives are nervous about, that we haven't noticed?
You think you have to go back a prior stage and talk about what Labour's problems are. And enough has been said about the structural problem of having these votes piled up in these great towering red islands in cities like Bristol, at least to date, amidst this huge blue ocean of Tory votes. Enough's been said about that for me not to have to add anything. But there are two other factors. One is time. I mean, time has really not been on Labour's side. Going back to Tim's point about these being mid-term, in the sense if there's an election in 2023, yeah, they're mid-term, but psychologically they're not, because COVID froze everything. That's true. But there's another sort of time factor here, which is the obvious one, that Boris Johnson he's reinvented the Tories, thanks to Brexit, after all that Tory period before. You know, the years of the coalition and David Cameron, right? He's just swept those aside as though they'd never happened and presented the Tories as a completely new force. So during the last election, there wasn't a sort of massive attack on Boris Johnson over David Cameron's record, because he'd broken away from it. And that's helped the Conservatives enormously, and mean that the passing of time for Labour is a bigger problem. They've got more time to have to wear this government down. You know, by now it should be worn down after about 10 years of Tory rule, far more than it has. And as for the leadership point at the end, I mean, just to sort of comment on this as someone who watches Tory activists, I find Tory activists pretty hard to read. So when I was trying to read what Labour activists were thinking of when they put in Keir Starmer, I could only get a rough feel for it. But I honestly didn't feel that they were putting Keir in to win. I thought they were putting Keir Starmer in to provide a bit of order, a bit of sort of sober, lawyerly intelligence after, you know, what is, as Tim said, has been really a dire period for the Labour Party. And up until these elections, I thought Starmer was more or less doing that. That's not enough to form the government. You know, providing good order to an opposition party. You'll win if you get lucky, if you get one of sort of Paula Sturridge's kind of freak events out of the blue that changes everything, but you're not going to create the momentum yourself, as you know, Tony Blair did in the 1990s. So they need someone quite different and something quite different. I think at the moment, honestly, I would think no one on the panel, certainly not myself, would have a clue what this new equivalent, very different sort of person from Tony Blair, very different politics from Tony Blair, but straddling that same kind of centre ground, I don't think we have a clear picture of what that person would look like yet.
Mm. And I mean, all I would say, I mean, I think Paul makes a number of very good points there, is that, you know, if they do move towards replacing the leader, and you know, I'm not saying that they will do or that they should do necessarily, but you know, this authenticity that Boris Johnson manages to bring to it, whether it is fake or not, does seem to be an incredibly important quality now in a leader. And you know, whatever you think of Keir Starmer and his strengths, for some reason he just doesn't connect in that way with the electorate. Now, you know, he may well be able to do that later on. He's got a sort of reasonable backstory and all those kinds of things. But in the end, you know, backstory can only do so much. You actually have to be now in our, you know, presidentialized, for want of a better word, mediatized system. You have to be a character. And it's finding someone who can be both a character and, you know, competent and you know, able to attack the government and able to bring the party together, that's going to be so difficult, I think, because they are facing the ultimate performative character, the ultimate showman. I mean, you know, Boris Johnson, as I think Paul's site has often pointed out, is a phenomenon. I mean, whatever you think of him, and you know, those of us who sort of can't in some ways see why he is so attractive to so many people, have to face the fact that he is so attractive to so many people, and working out why exactly that is the case is incredibly important, I think, for the Labour Party. And although they can't simply magic up a Boris Johnson of their own, this person can't obviously, you know, be a sort of ersatz Boris Johnson. They have to have that kind of, you know, character, that kind of emotional connection. You know, it's difficult to see Keir Starmer, I think, establishing that in the next, you know, 2-3 years.
Can I just add a kind of counterpoint to that?
Yeah.
Which is, not that I particularly disagree, but that it seems quite harsh to be judging any leader who's been a leader and only been able to appear on Zoom throughout that period. And actually, in the period of the election campaign before we got to the results, the polls were closing a little bit. We were starting to see a bit more of Starmer out and about, the incident in the pub with the glasses and so on, that was starting to make some of those connections. And I think it's again, it goes back to that timing thing, but judging whether or not a leader can connect with an audience when it hasn't actually been able to be in front of an audience seems a little bit harsh.
The problem is that first and second impressions count, and it's difficult, I think, to move people away from the judgments that they make. Certainly a year or two into your leadership, but you're right. I mean, going back to the point that we've all made about this sort of arrested development of the political cycle, it may be that there are more opportunities for Keir Starmer than there would be for a leader normally at this time in the political cycle. And I agree.
So it might be too early to start thinking of Keir Starmer as the sort of Neil Kinnock waiting for the guy who comes afterwards who can actually win an election.
Yeah.
That might be a bit premature. We're getting a lot of questions on the red wall seats, and I will put one of those questions to you. We've also getting questions about Tony Blair's prescription in his New Statesman piece. I don't know whether anyone has read that in sufficient detail to want to talk about it. I read the press reports about it. I must confess I haven't actually read the piece itself. But the question from Mady is, what do you make of Tony Blair's prescription of deconstruct and then reconstruct for the Labour Party? I don't know if any of you are comfortable speaking about this. I feel a bit bad asking you, seeing as I haven't read it myself. But
well, I have read it.
Okay.
I mean,
you're a step ahead.
Typically for Tony Blair, it's incredibly well written. Really neatly framed. But some people would argue, in some ways, a little bit too easy in the sort of focus on this sort of technological revolution, which seems to have kind of replaced globalization in his vocabulary. I mean, clearly, he makes a devastating point about you need someone who's both radical and interesting. And they've gone for someone who was radical, and then they maybe haven't got someone who's might be interesting, but I don't know. So that's a problem. I mean, I think in terms of what does he mean by deconstruction and reconstruction? Can you actually deconstruct a party and completely rebuild it? Well, you can say that he managed to do that, but of course, as you already pointed out, Anand, he did that after years and years of Neil Kinnock doing a lot of the groundwork. So in some ways, he didn't need to completely take the Labour Party apart and put it back together again. That wasn't what was required. He needed to kind of finish off a job of work. And the Labour Party is in much more trouble now than when Blair inherited the leadership in 1994. I mean, I think, if you were to really take him at his word, you would say he's talking about founding almost a completely new party. But of course, we saw where that ended up with Change UK. That doesn't mean it can't be done, but I think it can only be done in some ways with the consent of the Labour Party itself, with the consent of the Liberal Democrats, perhaps. In order to get a new centrist or centre-left party of the kind that the idea of complete deconstruction suggests, it can't be 7 or 8 MPs walking out. It probably can't even be 100 MPs walking out. It has to be a commitment on the part of the Labour Party itself to make a massive change, and probably the Liberal Democrats as well, some sort of merger. And that's just really difficult to see how that happens, given the way that the Labour Party itself is structured.
Does anyone else want to come in on Blair's intervention? Actually, before we get on to the red wall, I mean, just building on what Tim was talking about, the need for authenticity and having characters or whatever, but isn't one of the lessons of this election as well that actually competence really matters too? I mean, that's what we see in the sort of success of incumbents. Is that one of the lessons we should be taking from this? Is that competence still matters alongside all these other issues?
I mean, in a sense, it's come back to matter with COVID, isn't it? I mean, it was fascinating. We did have that period where Brexit dominated so much. I mean, it maybe seemed a long time ago, but where it was all about Brexit. And really there, it was so polarized, along this kind of clear fault line that all of a sudden it wasn't about, how well can you manage, the economy, or in this case, a public health crisis, but just, where do you stand on this deeply polarizing issue of identity? And then when you have something like, an economic crisis, or in this case, a public health crisis, and I guess also an economic crisis, then it does become about who can also govern. And I think one thing we sort of overlook when we talk about the timing, and we say, oh, but of course, the Tories would do well because they are doing so well, is that this has not been the case during the whole pandemic. We saw, if we look at the research, we saw an immediate sort of bounce, the sort of rally around the flag, which we saw here, really across the world in terms of incumbents benefiting all the way back in March, April, May 2020 from the pandemic. And then we saw, particularly here and in the US, actually a real decline in people's perception of how well this government, and of course also this hurt President Trump, a real decline in perceptions of what was how well it was done. And we forget this now with all these PPE crises. So, there is this kind of counterfactual alternative reality where the vaccine rollout would not have been as successful, where we would not be have had local elections without the vaccine, a successful vaccine rollout, without us opening up. We do have, very high death toll and a long period where the UK was seen in a European context as the worst performer. Now, of course, because of the vaccine rollout, we now are in a situation where, I always sort of I'm amused in the morning when I listen to the Today program, how any government ministers would say, oh, the world-beating vaccine rollout. There's a kind of these sort of, and that's always there. And of course, it's brilliant. And I think everyone in the UK will be thrilled about how well things are going there. But it's just to say that this was not always necessarily going to happen. And also the fact the vaccine rollout is going well does not mean that we will be in the same situation in 6 months or a year and a half. Clearly competence matters, and that mattered for that timing, but we're now going to face a situation where we come out of this, or we can just spend our way out of any kind of crisis, and where the Conservative, and Paul will no doubt have views, and that will also face some quite big internal questions. What do? You've had these very high levels of public spending that makes it almost impossible for Keir Starmer to articulate some kind of more left-wing economic vision than just basically paying everyone's salary who's out of a job. I mean, it doesn't get much more kind of socialist than that. And then, but then how are we going to increase taxes? Presumably that's an issue within the Conservative Party that Labour traditionally maybe find a bit easier to deal with. Are we going to keep spending like that? Are we, how do you reconcile this thing about leveling up and spending on red wall seats, as opposed to people in other areas who don't want higher taxes, who don't want higher corporation tax, and who are the conservative heartlands? What does it take for them to sort of say, actually, the Conservatives are no longer acting in their interest? So I just think with the timing point, again, that is not fixed either. Yes, the Conservatives are seen as competent now, and yes, competence matters more in a health crisis, but that is not something that's necessarily going to be permanent. And we've already seen that this government has been seen as quite incompetent in handling the crisis for quite long periods during the last 14 months.
On the this competence question is fascinating, because Boris Johnson doesn't do competence. He doesn't project competence. I don't mean he's incompetent. I mean he's uncompetent or acompetent. He's not what he's projecting emotionally. What he does is dazzling crashes and then equally dazzling recoveries. So in our own ConHome poll of party members, he was in negative ratings last autumn, having had a 93% approval rating after the general election of 2019, and now he's recovered. This has been the story of his career. And what he somehow has a sort of magical Falstaffian ability to do is to persuade voters that this mode of being or of politics is fun and sustainable and delivers in some way. So it'd be a really interesting question if at some point in the next few years, the working of time persuades voters that he's not delivering, which is possible. And it's one of the reasons why, coming back to some of where we all started, I think he would want the option of having this election in 2023, because it will come after a year of rapid growth, we're told. And people will presumably be feeling a certain liberation after lockdown, hoping we get out of it. And I think emotionally, tonally, that sort of election campaign would suit him down to the ground, because it's a kind of celebration. If the mood turned, if you have one of, I'm coming back again to one of sort of Paula's kind of unknown unknowns, that's a different matter.
And just on Sara's point about potential arguments within the Conservative family over the future direction of economic policy, is that something that is going to happen within both the parliamentary party and the party more broadly as we emerge from lockdown? Is there going to be that clear difference of opinion over?
I think in only 1 year since the crash, have you had growth as fast as before it? So everything, I think, will depend on whether the growth comes. So if the growth doesn't come, very often in the UK it doesn't, then there are agonizing decisions about what to do next. Do you put up taxes? Do you cut spending? Do you go the full, sort of American supply side route of cutting taxes and still hoping the growth comes? What about inflation? All these questions in the medium term are quite pressing. I'm not sure they're pressing before 2023, coming back to the election point. But sure, there are differences of view. But at the moment, the Tories are on such a kind of steeplechase by moonlight, and have been so relatively successful, that the sort of effective nationalisation of the railways, or turning back towards a more cooperative rather than a competitive model in health, they'll take all that in their stride as long as they're vaulting these fences by moonlight. When it gets more difficult, that's a different question. I mean, you're going to do the red wall stuff in a moment, so a question about that will be, how will those voters feel about it, and how will that affect Conservative MPs and the party as a whole?
Interesting. So on the red wall, I mean, I suppose there are two broad questions that are coming in from people watching at the moment. The first is, how should Labour go about winning back the red wall seats? But the second is, should this be Labour's focus? Which touches on what we were talking about earlier, actually, is should Labour be looking backwards, as it were, and figuring out how to get back the seats it traditionally held? And if so, how?
Well, I mean, just to come in, I mean, it should be looking to try and win some of those seats back, but it has to do that by looking forwards rather than backwards. I mean, Labour has got a real nostalgia problem, a real kind of fetishization of a traditional working class, which is, shrinking and of course changing at the same time. And Labour's also likes to see itself as the party of the underdog, or the oppressed, or the deprived, when clearly it wants to win those voters, but it actually also has to win, and this is what Blair was saying and has always been saying, it has to win voters who are not only sort of just about managing, but in some cases reasonably comfortably off as well. So it can't win those seats back by simply turning itself into a sort of culturally conservative party, wrapping itself in the flag. That clearly doesn't work because it doesn't look authentic. But nor can it do what, say, Angela Rayner is suggesting, and somehow sort of talk with a more working class accent and expect those people to come back to it. So it really has to, I think, focus on principally a kind of economic offer, an educational offer, and a sense of Labour understanding what the forces in society are that are going to shape all our futures, and a sense that Labour knows how to harness those and make a better society for everyone. But if it simply goes into an election saying, you need to vote for us because, somehow we're kind of morally superior, and or we've got this, working class heritage. That's just not going to work at all.
And of course, as Paul was saying, it's about far more than simply winning back seats you've lost. It's preventing further losses in those places like Doncaster, Pontefract, Normanton. But Paul, have you got any thoughts on this? What Labour should do and what it could do?
Of course, following Tim, Labour's got to think about the future, and that means having an economic message and a social message on the economy. You're going to get heard when the Tories fail, which will happen sooner or later, right? So that, to some degree, is out of Labour's hands. It's got to get a hearing. I mean, on the patriotic question, I do think there's a problem for Labour over time in losing the sense that it kind of did have with. I'm sorry to go back to Blair or Wilson, but when you saw the Union flag flying around a bit more and you felt that Labour meant it. I mean, Blair was greeted by a little kind of lake of Union flags being waved in Downing Street when he came in 1997. And I think Labour's at least got to sort of make its peace with patriotism. What it kind of doesn't want to feel, voters don't want to feel, is that the party has somehow got people in it who are saying that your type of voter in your type of place, is somehow to blame for everything historically. I think Labour's kind of got to be able to break away from that in order to help it have a bit of a hearing.
Interesting. Paula,
yeah, I think I'd want to sort of. I think Labour need to win some of those seats back. I don't think there's any other path to even a coalition without stopping further losses and winning some of those seats back. But I don't actually think a relentless focus on a small part of the country is the way to do that. So I think if they can connect with the right kinds of voters in all sorts of places, then that is the strategy to go for. And I think by constantly kind of, every single policy has to be checked as to whether or not the voters of Doncaster or Rotherham are going to go along with it is not a helpful way to try and make policy. And if you can reconnect with voters across a really broad spectrum, then you will hold those seats and you will also win Swindon, perhaps Reading, a few other places like that as well, where there are voters of a similar type. Now, I know John Curtis made this point on Monday about when Labour wins, it wins everywhere kind of idea. But I think the problem with that as an idea is that if you look at the different types of voters that Labour could win, it's already winning most of those in the kind of liberal left groups, most of those in those groups in the cities. So actually you can't rise up in that group much further. So you've got to win votes in the groups where you're doing less well. But I think thinking about those as voters with particular types of social profiles and values and identities is much more fruitful than thinking about them being located in particular kinds of places.
Are there lessons from other European countries that Labour could learn, Sara?
I mean, I think we touched upon this already, that that other European countries, we have social democratic parties that face similar sort of existential challenges, and because they have different, and are being wiped out certain places. But this sort of, and of course, what we see in other European countries is we tend to have these challenges not as in one large mainstream right-wing party like we have with the Conservative Party, but in a very fragmented party system. And the big question in Europe is often, do you try and appeal to voters of the radical right, who you might have lost, or what do you do about losing voters to the Green Party? And again, so this kind of challenge manifests itself as very concrete parties, whereas with the Conservative Party, they sort of managed to have this big, broad electoral coalition. So I don't think there's the one answer. I mean, everyone will have their own favorite case. Or is it Denmark where you're a bit tough on the Syrians and then you look like you can win some votes back? Or is it, is it the Spanish solution? But the truth is that these parties generally, do not win outright majorities. Generally, if they are in government, they're in government because they can form coalitions with other parties on the centre left. So I think the answer to saying, oh, if we just become a bit more like this and that, I mean, exactly like Tim and Paula were saying, they do have to be this broad umbrella, and there do have to be a sort of an economic vision that is one that appeals both to voters that might be more traditional Labour voters, but also does not alienate the more urban, metropolitan, well-educated and younger voters, and not only not alienate them, but excite them so they come out and vote. Because in one way, the Conservatives are benefiting from the fact they have an a relatively old electoral base, but that base really turns out and votes. Now, that's also a weakness for the Conservatives. If I was a Conservative strategist, I would be a bit worried that if you compare with Social Democratic voters in the continent, in fact, there's much bigger age skew in the UK. In other words, that younger voters vote much more overwhelmingly for Labour, but they turn out in lower numbers. So it's not just about getting people to be persuaded by the Labour message, but also getting all those younger voters. Again, there's a problem about the concentration and where are they, but still getting them to turn out to vote. But it clearly has to be, I think, fair criticism of the Labour campaign this time around is that even someone who's sympathetic to Starmer might say it's a bit difficult to know what he stands for in terms of, for example, the big economic vision. And I think some of that will be easier when we're not in the middle of a pandemic and when we don't have a Conservative Party that just writes blank checks for anything and anyone. And so in that sense, it's really almost impossible to outflank them with a better offering on the public services. So I think in some ways, Labour's it will be easier going forward for Labour to articulate that alternative vision.
Can I just come in there? I mean, it pains me to say it as someone who spent, most of their kind of professional life studying European politics as much as British politics. But to be honest, I think, Labour does have to look across the Atlantic rather than look across the Channel. For an example. Partly because the US is, a first past the post system, although clearly it's a presidential system as well. But I mean, I think the Biden campaign, in terms of its ability to straddle in the way that Sara and Paula were talking about, is probably a model, actually. And they did it with a candidate who was, not particularly actually a character, although he was quite authentic, I think, but was reassuring. And clearly, they were facing a very weak candidate in some ways in Donald Trump. And I think Boris Johnson is a much more difficult proposition than Donald Trump was. But, there are some lessons to be learned there in terms of bridging, quite a, potentially vociferous electoral coalition.
I do wonder actually sometimes whether Labour shouldn't just start by taking Boris Johnson a bit more seriously as a very, very talented politician than many of them seem capable of doing. We've got a question about Wales from Gethin Rees about what lessons, if any, Labour nationally should learn from the success of Mark Drakeford. I'm tempted to say glibly, well, they should win an election and they can benefit from incumbency. But Paula, you actually have some knowledge on this, unlike me. So
a little bit, not too much, but a little bit. Actually, there should be a blog about this coming on the UK ICE website fairly soon. So one of the things, obviously in Wales, there is also partly this incumbency effect going on, and we need to take that into account. Mark Drakeford's personal ratings improved over the course of the pandemic. His his kind of recognisability, the number of people who didn't say don't know when asked what they thought about Mark Drakeford, reduced significantly over the pandemic. So that does kind of say, well, you win elections and then you win elections, which doesn't really help you win elections. But I think the other thing that the Labour in Wales have been able to do is they've been able to connect with that sense of identity that we talked quite a lot about on Tuesday in the National Identities panel. So Welsh Labour have been able to really trade on that Welsh bit and been able to keep hold of voters who feel strongly Welsh. They were able to keep hold of a certain amount of the Leave support in Wales through that. And in the most recent elections, where there was a similar kind of level of UKIP support to wash out of the system, as it were, as there was in some of the English councils. Although the Conservatives gained some of that support, they didn't gain it all, and Welsh Labour were able to hold on to some of that. So I think one of the key lessons there for UK Labour is thinking about how they can connect with people and with people's sense of identities. And that's something that they haven't. It goes beyond competence, it goes beyond trust. It's very difficult. It's quite a soft thing to try and get a hold of, but it's something that UK Labour have been really bad at since at least 2010, and I think explains quite a lot of the structural problems that they face since then.
Yeah, can I just come in there? I mean, I think it's incredibly important that Labour try and develop an English identity, but it's going to be really, really difficult. I mean, in some ways, it shouldn't be that difficult because there's clearly a Welsh Labour Party, there's clearly a Scottish Labour Party, but the nostalgia that Labour has for both Scotland and Wales insists, you know, it makes it feel as if it must be a kind of UK party. But it would be advantaged very strongly, I think, by creating a more obviously English identity, because one of the things that the Conservatives have been very, very good at, obviously, is winning English voters. You know, the Conservatives in some ways don't need to do that because the development of the country has always been England first and then the Union, etc. But they don't need to do it so much, but Labour do. But it's going to be really, really difficult because if you think about how much trouble so many Labour members and supporters have with the Union flag, goodness knows how much trouble they have with Labour trying to to fly the cross of St George.
Yeah, I mean, and are we just implying that Labour should give up on Scotland? I mean, what can and should Labour try and do in Scotland? What strategy should they adopt? Do they have to sort of soften their position on India F2? I mean, is there anything they can do?
I think they could probably do something as a Scottish Labour Party, you know, completely isolating itself from the UK party, or not completely, but in the same way that the Welsh Labour Party have a very strong identity. But as far as the UK Labour Party is concerned, I mean, you know, I'll stretch my neck out and say no, it's gone. I mean, you know, they're just not going to win that many seats again, unless, of course, and Paul's always brought this up, you know, the whole independence thing erupts, we get a second referendum, the SNP lose it, and then there is perhaps rather more to play for. But unless and until that happens, I think Labour should, you know, not write off Scotland, obviously, but it should concentrate its efforts, you know, where it has more of a chance.
But doesn't that also mean that Labour will face a very difficult question in the next general election, where, if assuming Scottish independence is still on the agenda, I mean, now we talk a lot about, the Conservatives losing the Union and so on over Brexit, but Labour is going to find a difficult strategic challenge. What is their position going to be, you know, when they have to formulate a much more explicit position on Scottish independence or allowing them to have a referendum or not?
The awkward truth for the Conservatives is, from a certain point of view, they need a Labour revival in Scotland. From their own interest at Westminster, no. From the point of view of saving the Union, which matters to them emotionally, very much. And this brings one to the kind of interesting subject of tactical voting, which came up in the English context, because there was some evidence of it. I think, I'm not an expert on Scotland, I've not looked at the elections, but there was sort of some evidence, I think it was Dumbarton, where Labour held actually a crucial election, that pro-union Tory voters had gone out and voted Labour. The point I wanted to make is that's incredibly difficult to do. And I just sort of want to pour a little bit of cold water on this idea of a progressive alliance of sort of left-wing voting, because it doesn't necessarily happen. Just imagining, if you could get there, you have a Conservative fight against someone else, one individual candidate, under first past the post. You can't guarantee Labour voters will vote for a Liberal Democrat if they turn out, or a Green. You can't guarantee Liberal Democrat voters will vote Labour rather than Tory. As time goes on, maybe that's more likely. But, you know, coming back to Scotland again, this kind of tactical voting and candidate withdrawing, cliche, but it is like herding cats. It's very difficult to do.
Mm. No, I think and there is a piece on our website actually that is very, very profoundly sceptical about the potential for a progressive alliance. Paul, would you like to add anything on this progressive alliance point? Don't know if you were gesturing with your hand there or.
No, I just got a sore eye.
Oh, all right, okay.
Sorry.
I mean, we're a minute from our end time, and I've got a very, very bad track record of shooting way over time. So, I mean, there is nothing that's been massively upvoted among the questions. So I'm tempted to try and sort of do something I've never done before, which is to actually finish one of these events on time, at the time we promised the speakers. So as it's 14 minutes past, this is a good opportunity to thank all of you. I thought that was really, really interesting. There's all sorts of stuff to dig into here. I would say follow all 4 of our panelists on Twitter if you want to follow their work. Come back tomorrow. For those of you whose question hasn't been asked today or whose questions haven't been asked earlier this week, we have an event tomorrow that is just a simple come up and ask your questions. There'll be no sort of prior discussion. We're just going to go through all your questions and put them to our panel. So do come back at the same time tomorrow if you have questions that haven't been answered this week. But for the time being, Paula, Sara, Paul, Tim, thank you ever so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and thank you all for watching. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.